Australia, it's 4 hours universal time.
The world news from Radio Australia is read by Des Telfer. Heading this bulletin, the latest developments in the Philippines. The former president of the Philippines, Mr. Ferdinand Marcos, has arrived in the American Pacific territory of Guam. Mr. Marcos flew into exile on board an American Air Force medical evacuation plane from the American Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. A State Department official said he was lifted onto the plane in a stretcher because he appeared tired and frail, but walked off in Guam by himself. Officials said the plane was followed by a star lifter carrying the rest of the Marcos party, numbering 55 in all. The Pentagon initially said Mr. Marcos would be taken immediately to an American naval hospital in Guam for a checkup, but later said this had not been necessary. It said the period of time Mr. Marcos would spend on Guam and his further destinations were not yet known. The United States has said it's ready to welcome Mr. Marcos and his entourage, including former head of the Armed Forces, General Fabian Ver. Mr. Marcos left the Philippines following a military rebellion and popular uprising against his 20-year rule. Washington has already recognized the new government of Mrs. Corazon Aquino. Within hours of Mr. Marcos's abandonment of the presidential palace in Manila, thousands of Filipinos stormed the gates of the complex and began a spree of looting and destruction. At least one person was reported killed and 27 were injured. Millions of people took to the streets of Manila and other cities across the Philippines in celebrations. A State Department spokesman said Mr. Reagan's special envoy, Mr. Philip Habib, was on his way back to the Philippines to hold talks with the Aquino administration on how the United States could help in addressing the question of economic development and national security.
In 20 minutes at 4.
And welcome to International Report. I'm Judy Cooper. And from the Philippines, the Marcos family is expected to go to the United States, which has again offered asylum. The sudden overnight departure leaves President Aquino, a relatively inexperienced politician, to establish her government and policies. While she's been left to grapple with enormous problems, Mr. Marcos has now been admitted to the Guam Military Hospital for tests and medical treatment. But where will he spend his exile? John Highfield asked Jim Middleton in Washington if there was any firm information coming out of the United States Capitol.
The current bet is that he may well end up in Hawaii, where he already owns a couple of rather palatial houses, views of Diamond Head and Waikiki. He has stayed in them before. At this stage, however, our spies on Hawaii say that there's no sign that they've been prepared for habitation. But that does seem to be quite a possibility.
Well, I suppose at this stage we shouldn't put too much emphasis on spies. Let's look at the reality. Has President Reagan had anything further to say?
Nothing more. In fact, he hasn't had anything to say today. It was George Shultz, the Secretary of State, who spoke. Mr. Reagan did pose playfully for the cameras in the snow at the White House and threw a few snowballs, which I suppose is being taken by the networks here as an indication of his good mood, but that's about all we've had from the Oval Office or outside the Oval Office.
So President Reagan is feeling relaxed about the whole thing. What's Congress up on Capitol Hill saying? Have they had any changes of heart on what has been coming from them in the past week? A fairly hard stance that Marcos must go. How are they fitting in with the new order?
They are accepting everything very nicely. In fact, perhaps the most strident critic of Mr. Marcos in Congress, Stephen Solars, a congressman from New York who was in fact a personal friend of Benigno Aquino, so has been on something of a crusade against Mr. Marcos in recent years, turned around today after having been highly critical of Mr. Reagan's actions in the past few weeks and months. Said he should have called a long time ago for an end to American aid, should have called on Mr. Marcos to resign, etc., etc. Today he praised Mr. Reagan almost as highly as the Secretary of State George Shultz praised Corazon Aquino, even someone as prominent a critic of Mr. Reagan as Senator Ted Kennedy threw in his backing behind Mr. Reagan and said that it had been a wonderful act on his part.
So a genuine sense of relief on Capitol Hill that things didn't turn bloody in the Philippines, I guess.
Absolutely. The other thing that's happening, of course, is, as you know, late last week there were moves in Congress to cut off aid to the Marcos government. Now, in fact, there's been a complete switch around, and to help the Aquino government get the country out of the economic mess that it finds itself in, there are many, many moves to increase American assistance to the Philippines in light of the switch of government.
And I suppose the Americans will now be putting pressure on other international funding, like the International Monetary Organization, the World Bank and that, to come good with funds.
It's too early to speculate on that, John. You've also got to remember that under the stringent budget proposals or actions that have been taken here, even loosening up a bit of additional cash for the Philippines in an emergency is a bit difficult under the legislation they've now got, which requires cuts to bring the budget deficit down to zero by 1990.
That was Jim Middleton in Washington talking to John Highfield. Australia has joined the international community in recognising the new government of President Corazon Aquino, and says the Philippines can realise its full potential in the region. From Canberra, Graham DeBell reports.
The Prime Minister, Mr Hawke, announced that he'd sent a message of congratulations and best wishes to President Aquino. Mr Hawke said it was a great victory. The will of the Filipino people had prevailed. Australia now looked forward to developing a relationship which was based on shared respect for political freedom, human rights and democratic choice. The message said that in recent years the Philippines had not been able to participate to its fullest potential in the expanding interrelationships of the region. Mr Hawke said that while the previous regime was in office, he'd chosen not to visit the Philippines as Prime Minister. Now the relationship could have a new start, a point the Prime Minister made when he spoke to reporters later.
Well, I'm pleased that it's been resolved now, as it should have been. The corruption that took place in the elections clearly had meant that the will of the Philippine people had not been given effect to. Now Mrs. Aquino will assume the presidency, and they can get on with the task of bringing economic development to the people of the Philippines within the framework of democracy.
Do you think she's equipped to handle the problems of the Filipino economy?
Well, there is no reason to assume that she's not. And after all, leadership is not simply a question of some profound, detailed, theoretical knowledge of economics. She will, I'm sure, gather around her people who have the necessary expertise, and she seems to have, as a leader, as I say, the determination, capacity of application which is required to undertake the very important and difficult task that lies ahead of her.
Do you think it will be any more than just a transfer of power from one wealthy group to another wealthy group?
Yes, I think it will be more than that, because I would believe that Mrs. Aquino will realise that the world is looking now not for that sort of transfer of power and influence, but an application of the powers of the presidency and of the powers of administration to advancing the real interests of the masses of the Philippine people.
Is it fair that Mr. Marcos would be leaving the country? Could he stay in the Philippines and be judged by his people?
Well, I think that the events of the last few weeks have basically been marked by a relative lack of violence, which is to the credit of the Filipinos, and I don't think that very much is served by a detail going into the events that have led up to this position. The only thing that I must say that I find galling, and I would think the people of the Philippines find particularly galling, is the apparent rape of the wealth of the Philippines by President Marcos. He seems to have salted away an enormous amount. Some put it in the billions, others in the hundreds of millions. I think if some way could be found to ensure that proper property of the people of the Philippines could be restored, that would obviously be a good thing.
Can you understand why President Reagan seems so happy to be offering Mr. Marcos and his family asylum?
I haven't noticed happiness.
Prime Minister, do you think that the Americans could have acted a little sooner, given that they had knowledge of this salting away of cash that you referred to some time ago?
Well, I guess that the United States administration wanted to be quite sure that the processes were going to work out there in a way which did reflect the will of the people there, and they did not want to wish to be too precipitate in their invention. I would say that it's very hard to be critical of the way in which the United States has played their hand in the events of the last few weeks. I must say it's a little bit interesting to see that in terms of outside observation as to what's happened, the Soviet Union, who seems to be the defender of President Marcos and accusing the United States of being too forthcoming in its intervention in support of Mrs. Aquino. A very interesting state of affairs.
That was the Australian Prime Minister, Mr. Bob Hawke. And on the issue of the wealth amassed by Mr. Marcos and his cronies, it seems likely they'll be able to retain all of it. Here's Martin Gillam.
Despite their denials, it's well documented that the Marcoses own several $100 million worth of property in New York. Bank memos and real estate documents have already surfaced this week, showing that the former president and first lady have put 4 of their Manhattan properties up for sale for $300 million American. Now more information has been published giving details of alleged secret meetings Mrs. Marcos held with her American associates in New York over the past few years, setting up her real estate deals. According to the New York Post, Mrs. Marcos chaired meetings with lawyers specializing in foreign investment and New York real estate in a mansion on New York's swank Upper East Side. The mansion is said to be decorated with $10 million worth of antiques and paintings, which might also belong to her, although the mansion apparently does not. The Post, quoting congressional testimony and conversations with those involved, says the main topics of discussion were what to buy and how to raise the enormous mortgages. For example, Mrs. Marcos was reported worried about raising $30 million to buy the Herald Center shopping tower between Macy's and Gimbel's. A line of bank credit was quickly set up. Secrecy was all important. Dummy companies in the Dutch Antilles were listed as the official owners, and telex messages between New York and Manila were coded. Buildings were given names like Midtown Cement and Farragamo, and the American go-betweens were dubbed Lafayette and the Superintendent. Lafayette, alias property dealer Joseph Bernstein, is strongly rumored to be buying 3 of the Marcos New York buildings, including the Herald Center, for $250 million US. His uncle owns a giant textile company in the Philippines and is a close friend of the former president. Bernstein denies any links with the Marcoses, but says that if he does buy their 3 buildings for $250 million, the owners will lose on the deal. Other New York real estate sources estimate the Marcoses would pocket about $95 million American. And given the great pains the Reagan administration has gone to make resignation as easy as possible for Mr. Marcos, it seems highly unlikely they'll treat him like the Ayatollah or Colonel Gaddafi and impound his American assets. Even a Democrat Senator, John Glenn, said today it would be better for the Marcoses to come and spend their money in America than to spend it all in Switzerland.
That was Martin Gillam reporting. The new Aquino government now has the daunting task of reshaping the debilitated Filipino economy, an economy that for years has been shackled by chronic corruption and mismanagement. The Philippines has a huge foreign debt. Some banks' estimates put it much higher than the official figure of United States $30,000 million. And with a per capita income of much less than US $800 per year, the Philippines has little chance of paying the money back, let alone servicing the huge interest bill on the debts. In Washington, officials of the World Bank are waiting to hear from the new government in Manila. The call will herald the Aquino government's first step in getting the country's economy back on its feet. Economics reporter Robin Harris asked the World Bank's Atala Sumnes, a specialist in Filipino affairs, what assistance the bank could offer.
It is technical assistance, it is provision of advice on overall policies as well as specific projects or sectors. It is provision of funding for projects. It is provision of policy-based funding. It has always been a mix of things, and Philippines is large enough an economy that I would imagine there will be scope for for a mix of actions. And we cannot really, as a matter of policy, dissociate one aspect of assistance from others, obviously.
The outgoing government of President Ferdinand Marcos had a game plan which forecast a 6% growth rate between 1983 and 1987. Was it illusory to forecast a growth of that nature when, in reality, the Philippines has been lucky to report anything more than 2% growth GNP?
With the hindsight, that figure proved to be illusory, right? But historically, when you take an earlier period, say from 1972 to 1981, the record has been more in the order of 6.5% growth. On the other hand, over the last 2 years, the growth has been negative, and strongly negative.
From the point of view of the World Bank, are you reasonably confident that the new government of Corazon Aquino will institute the necessary reforms to get the Philippines economy back on its feet?
Look, we have not talked to them yet. We have not discussed any of the issues with them. So all I can say is it would be just a priori answer. And on that basis, of course, I have no doubt. I have no reason to doubt that it will not be.
How long before you will be conducting discussions with the new government?
Oh, I'm sure it will be very much up to the new government. They have to establish a cabinet yet, and they have to find the time to talk to us.
That was World Bank official Atalas Sunes. Ferdinand Marcos always promoted himself as a savior of democracy, but during his rule, human rights abuses were legion. People were simply snatched off the streets and disappeared from view. The army and police had sweeping powers of arrest, and they were not adverse to using torture. Well, all this changed, though, simply because of the change in the head of state. Greg Wildsmith reports.
Execution, torture, disappearances, any study of the human rights record of the Marcos regime is studded with such words. Execution refers to those students and priests, trade unionists, journalists and rural activists gunned down by the Philippine Armed Forces, the constabulary, the intelligence services, all for the crime of promoting opposition to Mr. Marcos and his cronies. According to a church-sponsored human rights organization, Task Force for Detainees of the Philippines, there were 445 such executions in 1984, or salvagings, as they were known to the military. The slaughter was indiscriminate. Last September, in the city of Escalante, at the north of Negros Island, soldiers fired on demonstrators demanding rights for the hungry and higher wages for plantation workers. When the gunfire stopped, more than 20 people lay dead. The then acting chief of the Defense Forces, General Ramos, defended the military, saying they acted in self-defense. General Ramos